Hi, everyone. Welcome back to this workshop series, the how-to guide for developing survey questionnaires. All right, so this is a four-part workshop series, and this video is specifically on putting together a survey questionnaire. And so in this series, we've covered kind of the first few steps of developing survey questions. What is it you want to know? What's your research goal? How do you start kind of utilizing the tools that survey research provides you? And then the second video was on the very kind of specific guidelines of writing good quality survey questions. Then the third video was on about their answer options. So how do you write good quality answer options to go along with survey questions when you're running multiple choice questions, for example, in a survey? And then finally, this video, this fourth video, that kind of ties all of that together and kind of talks about the general structure of a questionnaire, putting all the questions together for a survey, and making sure it flows nicely, that respondents can easily answer your survey. And so if you're conducting survey research and you're building a survey questionnaire, this workshop series is definitely for you. And this fourth video kind of wraps it all up and ties it all together to kind of get you going to actually launch your survey and go and collect your data. So my name is Sarah Wilkins-Laflamme. I'm your host for this workshop series. I'm an associate professor in sociology and legal studies at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. I'm a survey methodologist expert, so I've been running surveys here in Canada as well as internationally for over 10 years now. I also use a lot of other people's survey data from governments and from other research teams. So I'm a general quantitative methods expert. My substantive area of interest is the field of sociology of religion. I'm really interested in how religion impacts other aspects of social and political life, things like voting behavior, things like volunteering activities. I also specialize in ethnicity and immigration, social change, and political sociology. So you have my email up here on the slide. Please feel free to reach out anytime if you have any questions tied to this workshop. I'm more than happy to help if I can. And this workshop series is done in partnership with the Siskel Consulting and Survey Research Unit at the University of Waterloo. Now, this is a workshop we typically run in person once or a year or every 2 years at the unit. And so we decided it would also be good to have a virtual format for this workshop. But the unit provides a lot of various services for survey research and for statistical analysis. So we have a lot of different types of workshops, some of them virtual, some of them in person. We also provide statistical analysis consultations. So if you're running data analyses, statistical models, you have some questions, you can consult with our experts on the team. We also provide a whole array of survey research services. So if you have a survey that you want to run, but you're not really sure how to do that, or you just don't have the time to do it yourself, well, we've got a whole team that's cost recovery, and we'll provide you with those services. So we'll help you develop your questionnaire, program it, run the actual survey, whether that be online or by telephone or by mail or in person, and then even provide you with some basic data analyses if needed, cleaning the data, of course. And so those are all services at cost recovery prices that the Siskel Consulting and Survey Research Unit offers at the University of Waterloo. So just look them up and reach out. Their email is on their website that you can find through Google. And if you are looking for survey services. Like I mentioned, so this workshop series is in four parts. So this video is the fourth part, the last bit of the workshop. That is all about the kind of overall. So you've already developed your survey questions, you've got your survey answers, and now you want to put them all together in this thing that we call a survey questionnaire. Well, that's what we're going to cover in this video. And the examples of most of the data that I'm using today in this workshop come from the 2023 International Social Survey Program, National Identity and Citizenship Questionnaire. And so that is a cross-national survey, the ISSP, that's run every year across 44 countries. I run it here in Canada. And the theme for 2023 was national identity and citizenship. And so that survey was made up of about 60 questions on things like attitudes towards democracy, immigration, national identity, and more. And so if you're interested, you can find out more about the ISSP at their website, so at issp.org. And all their data is open access. And so if you're looking to analyze good quality social scientific data across a whole variety of countries, well, the ISSP might be for you. So go check them out. Okay, so let's talk about putting together a survey questionnaire. So, first question I always get, and it's an important one. How long should the survey questionnaire be, right? How many questions is too many questions? How many questions maybe not enough questions? In other words, how many questions should you have in your questionnaire? General rule of thumb, the shorter the better, right? People have short attention spans now. And so the fewer questions you need to put to respondents, the better, the more respectful you are of their time, the quicker you get the survey done. Hopefully, the higher your response rates are. And so, the shorter you can go, the better. I mean, the ISSP survey takes about 20 to 25 minutes to complete. That's considered a pretty long survey. A lot of surveys now are just trying to take a few minutes or even a few seconds if possible. And I do this because they're usually on people's phones, on their smartphones. But it's obviously depends on how many questions you need to gather the information you want to answer your research questions and address your research goals. So there's, some variability here. But do keep in mind that the longer your survey is, the higher likelihood that people will quit after a while, so won't necessarily respond as high levels, so you'll have higher non-response rates. You might get poor quality answers, especially near the end when people are getting tired and they're answering questions more and more quickly and maybe not as accurately as you'd hope. And if you're paying a polling firm for a sample, for example, that's representative of the wider population or of a certain study population, well, longer surveys will also cost you more money. Usually it kind of goes in blocks of time. You pay by the number of respondents, of course, but also the length of the survey. And so keep that in mind that, you need, in that case, you'd need more resources to be able to do a longer survey. So, what are some kind of general guidelines about structuring your questionnaire, right? So, you figured out which questions you want to include. You've got them down to the kind of core questions that you need to address your research goals. And so now it's time to kind of put them into a certain order in your questionnaire. So typically, we'll put demographic questions either right at the start or right at the end of a survey. Sometimes a bit of both, depending on the needs of the survey. So, these are demographic questions are questions people are often quite used to answering, things like age, level of education, income, marital status, those types of questions. And so, people answer those quite a bit in various types of censuses and surveys over the course of their lifetime. And so they're usually more straightforward questions. So you can either start the survey with them to kind of get things going a bit more quickly, or finish the survey with them to kind of, once respondents are maybe a bit tired, they've spent a lot of brain power on earlier questions, well, then they can more easily answer the demographic questions at the end about themselves that they're quite familiar with. If you do put the demographic questions at the start, you can kind of use them to verify eligibility of respondents for the survey. So, for example, if your survey is only for people 18 years and older, or only for Canadian residents, right, something like that, well, then you can check that by asking of age and area of residence at the start of the survey. Also, if you're using sociodemographic quotas, right, you want a certain percentage of your respondents to have a certain level of education or to be of a certain age, or to be of a certain gender or to be from a certain region. Well, then you probably want to put those questions first. So you establish, okay, well, which quota do you fall into? And so that if that quota is already filled, there's already enough respondents of those characteristics, then the respondents immediately sent to the end of the survey, thanking them for their participation. And same thing, if the respondent isn't eligible to complete the survey, well, they haven't completed the whole survey before you figure that out. You figure that out from the start and you thank them, and then they don't have to deal with the rest of the survey. So yeah, so that's where you'd kind of put your demographic questions either at start or the end or a bit of both. And now your other questions, your kind of what I call the more substantive questions of your survey. These often should be grouped into sections, and how you group them kind of depends on the nature of the questions, right? If you're starting off with some general questions and then you follow up with some more specific questions, well, that's usually the order we go in. We do general questions first, kind of bigger picture questions, more general questions, and then we kind of come with the kind of more and more specific survey questions afterwards. So that's one way of grouping survey questions in a questionnaire. Or maybe you have questions on different themes, and so you group them them together. So the kind of respondents start with a few demographic questions, then they get into a certain theme, have a few survey questions on that, move to another theme, have a few survey questions on that. It kind of makes the progression of the questionnaire logical in the mind of the respondent, which is actually quite helpful to kind of keep them moving along and keep them engaged with the survey. And it also kind of gets them in the right kind of certain mental space, if you want, of answering questions on a certain theme before moving on to another theme. When you kind of mix up all the themes, you throw survey questions all over the place, you don't necessarily group them thematically, it can seem like that way to respondents, and they might feel that's a bit annoying or kind of feel a bit lost or not really sure what's coming. And any of those factors can actually drive higher non-response rates. People might decide not to answer your survey. And it might just frustrate respondents, which is not the kind of frame of mind that you want them in when they're answering your survey. And so, yeah, group your survey questions into themes. And you can also introduce the theme, like just with a sentence or something at the start of that theme in the questionnaire. So it'd be like, okay, now some questions about democracy. And then there's some questions about people's attitudes and thoughts on democracy. So that's kind of ways you can kind of thematically group your survey questions and then kind of introduce them to the respondent so it makes sense to them. There's a nice flow to the questionnaire and they're happy filling it out, basically. Yeah. So, but any other way of grouping your survey questions that makes sense, that works, is also useful and can be used in your survey questionnaire. So some more kind of guidelines when structuring your questionnaire. So if you have any survey questions that could be considered sensitive or potentially triggering for certain people, so if you've got questions about victimization, for example, or, issues that are very contentious, that can be actually quite emotionally problematic for certain individuals, well, you don't want to start the survey with those, but you also don't want to end the survey with them either. You usually typically put those more sensitive or potentially triggering questions about 2/3 of the way through the survey. You can vary that a bit, but the idea here is not to have them right at the beginning or right at the end. You don't want them at the beginning because if the survey immediately starts with some really heavy, difficult questions, that will probably discourage some individuals from answering your surveys. So you'd have higher non-response rates, which is not what you want. You want higher response rates. You want people to answer your survey. On the flip side, if these difficult questions come right at the end, it kind of leaves the respondent, that's what the respondent will remember from the survey. And it could leave the respondent potentially in a kind of somewhat traumatized or emotionally difficult kind of headspace at the end of the survey, right? Because we typically remember kind of the last bits of what we did for that kind of survey. And that's not where you want to leave the respondent, right? You want to leave them in a good state. You don't want to cause harm to your respondents. And so typically those more sensitive or potentially triggering questions, you would put kind of in somewhere in the middle of your survey questionnaire to kind of build up to them and then to kind of wind down from them in a way that's kind of respectful of respondents and that deals with these issues in a serious way, but also doesn't freak people out at the start or leave them traumatized at the end. If you have any kind of especially interesting or fun survey questions that you think could be quite fun for respondents, usually you place those at the closer to the start of the survey to kind of keep people engaged, to kind of, oh, wow, this is interesting. And so they keep going and they actually are more likely to fill out your survey, which is what you want. And generally just kind of work on the flow of your questionnaire, like kind of any text that you're structuring or anything that you're putting together. Think of that flow, right? It's almost like you're taking a respondent through a journey when you're working them through a survey questionnaire. And so keep that in mind, right? Make the journey pleasant, make it as easy as possible. And so kind of, think about, which questions should go together, how should I be grouping them, which one should come first. So kind of make a nice flow that kind of makes sense for a respondent and makes them want to fill out the survey. You're always aiming for user friendliness, clarity, and accessibility, right, with respondents. So make it as easy as possible for them to fill out the survey. And in return, hopefully you'll get the reward that more people do fill out your survey and complete it in its entirety and take the questions that you're putting to them seriously and give you accurate information. Okay, so specifically about formatting now. I mean, there's lots of ways to format a survey questionnaire. There's not one right way of doing it, but just some things to keep in mind. So your questionnaire design and format will depend on how you're going to administer your surveys. So what's your survey mode? If you're doing the survey over the phone or as an in-person interview, then you're there as an interviewer, or your people that you're hiring to be interviewers are there. And so they're there to answer kind of if respondents have issues with the survey question, they can provide further instructions for a survey question. So you can provide the interviewer with further instructions, and then the interviewer can just make the call of if the respondent needs or not, then they provide them. But keep in mind, whenever there's an interviewer present, that issue of social desirability bias that we talked about in the first video of this workshop series, where people give the answer that they think others want to hear and that they themselves also would like to hear. That is what we call social desirability bias. Things like, indicating you make more money than you actually do, or that you work out more than you actually do. Anything that's seen as like a social good in our society, people might be more prone to kind of inflate how much it is they have of it or how much they do of it. And or on the flip side, if it's seen as a something that's socially negative in our society, people will deflate, will kind of undermine it, or kind of minimize how much of it they do or how much how a certain way they think. And that effect you have in any kind of survey format, even online in an anonymous setting, but you especially have it when there's an interviewer present. So that's kind of the downside to having an interviewer present. But the upside is that you can have instructions that you can provide to respondents if they're not sure about something, if they have a question about answering a specific survey question. And so those instructions would be part of the survey questionnaire, but only the part that the interviewer would see and that could utilize if they needed with the respondent. That compares to, say, a self-administered mailback survey where you mail out the survey questionnaire and then the respondent mails it back to you. There, if any instructions that you think are essential for the respondent to be able to understand the survey question, along with the survey question itself and the answer options, of course, they all have to be provided in the actual questionnaire, right? They can't just be like optional in the background. They have to be in the questionnaire because there is no interviewer present to provide further instruction. And there's also other things to think about that you should be providing in a mailback questionnaire that respondents look at. You should be providing them information with how they should answer the question. So do they check a box? Do they circle an answer, right? I know it seems like small and not super important, but it actually is. And if those instructions are clear to the respondent, then again, it's easier to kind of figure out what they're meant to do with the survey questionnaire. And again, be clear and consistent here with these instructions throughout your survey questionnaire. When it's a mailback survey, things like drop-down menus and filter conditions, they can exist, but they have to be very basic and very short. So like a filter question, so you can be like, so did you vote in the last federal election? Yes. Okay. If you answered yes, go to question 2. Which federal party did you vote for? Or if you answered no, you did not vote, go to question 3 or something, right? So a basic filter, right, people can figure out. And we see those in like the census and certain big StatsCan surveys as well when they're mailback. But for the most part, they should be very basic. They can't really have any level of complexity to them. They can't be too long because people just get lost and won't be able to follow them because, again, they have to kind of do it themselves on paper with the mailback survey. Compared with, say, a self-administered survey online, and in a more anonymous setting, then you can kind of format things in your questionnaire like more complex filter options, drop-down menus that may be a bit longer that people can scroll down. So there's a bit more flexibility there with online surveys, and it kind of then just depends on what kind of programming software you're using. For example, if you use Qualtrics, a very common software to program your survey questionnaire to run it online, there's lots of options there of what you can do, how you format the questionnaire, different aspects of formatting each survey question. Keep in mind, though, for online surveys, a lot of people complete them on their smartphones. And so they have to be formatted in a way that they're easy to read on a smartphone. And obviously, that's you kind of format the questionnaire, you program your survey questions, and then you kind of do a test on your smartphone to see what it looks like. But keep in mind that, it's not, you don't have a massive screen to work with. People's screens are small, and so it has to work usually with a smartphone is kind of what we're aiming for these days. So I kind of mentioned programming software. So if your survey is a self-administered web survey, which most are now online, so you're programming your survey questionnaire using this kind of software that programs the questionnaires, that helps you program the questionnaires. Then obviously the formatting options are part of those programs. So you kind of select what's available to you in that software. So again, I mentioned Qualtrics, and here at the University of Waterloo, we have licenses. If you're a member, you don't have to pay for Qualtrics, so there's that's available to you. Or some other kind of like free software that's like Google Forms, for example, which is actually pretty good programming software for survey questionnaires in its free version, much better than, say, the free version of SurveyMonkey, which I don't think is very good. So if you don't want to pay anything, Google Forms is a pretty good free option, and there's a few varieties like Microsoft Forms and stuff like that as well. But if you do have a bit of money or you're part of a university that has a Qualtrics license, Qualtrics is pretty good. It does more. It has more stuff available. It's very user friendly. It's probably the most common type of questionnaire software that we have, and it makes sending out the survey, the next steps after you've programmed the questionnaire, very easy as well, I find. And so, yeah, keep in mind that, Google Forms will have certain formatting options or a certain formatting look for your questionnaire. Qualtrics, the same idea. You can, there's some things you can choose and play around with there, but there is often like a certain look to these questionnaires. And so that will be impacted by the software you use. And also just kind of a little side note here, with these software, you can include a completion bar for respondents. So that's a little bar at the top or at the bottom of the screen, doesn't really matter, where respondents can see how far to the survey they are, how much of the survey do they have left? Are they like 25% through, 75% through? I really like that. I'm someone who, as I'm completing a survey, really want to know how much I have left. And generally, people seem to be more like me on that front. And so, generally, completion bars are seen as a good thing to include in your survey questionnaire. Again, this is more for the online version of running a survey. However, there are some instances where it can also discourage respondents. So say they spend some time filling out the survey questionnaire, and then they see in the completion bar, they still have like a huge amount of the survey to go. It's a longer survey. That can be discouraging to certain respondents. So some researchers don't like including them, but generally it's up to you. It's not the end of the world either way. But I typically recommend a completion bar just to kind of be more transparent and giving your respondent more information so that they kind of, are kind of, again, you're taking along this journey, them along this journey, and they're kind of aware of what's going on and the whole process. A kind of cautionary note here, when you're playing around with formatting, like the colors you want to use, again, this is kind of more programming online, but also like in a paper, a questionnaire, for example. Be careful of using like things like special fonts, colors, highlighting, bolding, certain images that draw attention. You obviously can use all of those options. Those are all available to you, but be very careful when you do, because sometimes you unwittingly lead respondents to a certain answer by using some of those formatting options. So, I mean, I have an example here up on the slide. This is from the Liberal government's, I believe, 2016 survey called mydemocracy.ca. This was a survey the government, the kind of relatively newly elected Justin Trudeau Liberal government back in 2015, 2016. They sent out to every Canadian household, they sent out a little card getting people to go online and fill out this survey. And it was all about electoral reform. This is when the Liberals were still thinking about electoral reform. And they wanted to know Canadian preferences on a variety of issues related to electoral reform. As a side note, the survey questions in this survey were awful. like I've like when I did the survey as like part of my civic duty, and I've like if my undergrad students had given me these survey questions as part of their projects, they would have lost many, many points, and I would have been disappointed because these were like very basic, terrible mistakes that were made about survey questions. All the guidelines we saw in the second video of this workshop series, most of them were broken and not respected, and I thought overall it was a terrible survey. I'm sorry if you worked on this survey, but hopefully you learned from your mistakes if you did. And unfortunately, it led to garbage results because the results were all over the place because the survey was so bad. And so the Liberals use that as an excuse to like negate on their promise of electoral reform and move on and not commit to electoral reform. But in reality, it was because the questions weren't very good. And I mean, the better your survey questions, the more accurate and kind of better your response and data that you get from people to actually know what their actual preferences are for electoral reform. So this question here has many issues to it, has many problems. One of them being the question itself is way too long. So, let me read it to you and you'll see it as I read it. Members of parliament that always support policies that they think are best for their constituents, even if their constituents disagree, or members of parliament that always support policies their constituents want, even if the MPs themselves personally disagree. Which would you prefer? I mean, that's a really long survey question, like too long, in my opinion. It's a bit complicated. By the time I finish reading it, I've forgotten what it's asking me. It saves it a little bit by in the two answer options, the two answer boxes here that are provided. They kind of repeat a bit the summary of each one, like MPs do what they feel is best, or MPs do what their constituents want. But too long of a survey question should have been abbreviated and made much more simple for people to understand. So that's one issue. One positive here is you'll see the completion. It's not a bar here, but it's like a completion donut at the top. Hopefully my little box of myself here doesn't block it out for you, but there is like a little completion circle. And like, for example, I know that I'm at like 58% completion of this survey. But I wanted to highlight another issue with this survey question. So what I'm showing here is exactly how I see it. I screenshot this before I touched anything on this online survey questionnaire. And so you see it just like this when you start answering. So can you think of what the issue is here? And again, it's kind of to the theme of like fonts, highlighting, coloring, that sort of thing. There is a major issue of just how this question was formatted and like programmed into the questionnaire, not its content, which is also bad, but also how it was formatted causes a real problem. So take a few seconds here, think about it. If you want more time to think about it, just pause the video. But I'll go ahead and give you my thoughts on this. The fact that one of the answer options, MPs do what their constituents want, has a different background color and a different font color. It's white on blue here. Kind of draws your attention more to it, right? That's a typical style that we use for signage, right? We have a dark blue background with white lettering. That means that's a type of color combination that you can see from far away. Even people who have terrible eyesight like I do can see that can read the text from further away. But the problem here is that it really draws your attention to that answer option, which in some cases could bias the results because people are kind of reading and then they're drawn visually to that kind of second answer option. MPs do what their constituents want. And so might be more likely to select it for no other reason than it was just formatted differently. It was just kind of has different coloring to it. So you really want to be careful when you're presenting answer options, you really want to present them in the same way so that there's not one specific one that kind of visually draws the attention of the respondent just due to like the font or the coloring or something, right? You want the respondent to kind of see the answer options equally and select the one that's most appropriate for what they think or what they do, for example. So it's almost like they're highlighting the second option, and it's not because my mouse was over it or anything. It was just because that's the way it was formatted, and that's actually problematic. And so don't do that. Be very careful about that sort of thing. So this is why I say you can use coloring, you can use fonts. It makes it visually more exciting for respondents. It's never really a bad thing, but just be careful that you're not like biasing people's responses by using those tools. Other things you should be careful for. This is maybe less of an issue now, but it was more in the past. In a lot of like paper questionnaires, survey questions would be asked in like a grid format. So you're asking about, what people think about a certain statement or how important they think certain things are. And then, so all the answer options are like the same question to question. So it's like in a grid format. I have an example up here from the ISSP. So all different various things that could be related to being a good citizen, and then kind of how important do respondents think that is for being a good citizen, not important at all the way to very important, and they select the answer option that they think is most adequate for their attitudes here with the can't choose option as well. I did not program this question when I ran the 2023 ISSP. I did not program it as a grid, so don't worry. I'm not falling into this problem. But some people might, and especially in the past when you did paper versions of a questionnaire, it was very common to see these types of grids for like a series of add to questions, and the series like answer options are same question to question. The problem with the grid format is that people are prone to straight lining, or certain people are prone to straight lining. So if they're trying to get through the survey quickly, maybe they're not they don't necessarily care about giving you accurate information. They just want to get done with it. So they might just select like all the one options for all the questions, or they might just go like diagonally and select like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 across all the different statements. Some kind of straight lining where they answer all in the same way or a certain way that gets them through this more quickly. You don't want that, obviously. You want them to kind of look at each statement and pick the answer that best represents their own attitudes. And so, in order to do that now, when we program a survey online, we program it usually so that respondents get one of these at a time. Okay, so there are different options as to what it takes to be a good citizen. As far as you are concerned, personally, on a scale of 1 to 7, where 1 is not at all important and 7 is very important, how important is it? 1, never to evade taxes. And that's the first one. They see only that one on their smartphone, like if they're answering it, or they're on their computer screen. And then they have to select an option, 1 to 7, or the -8 can't choose. Then next page, once they've done that, they get 17, always to obey laws and regulations. Answer that next one, 18, to keep watch on the actions of government, and so on and so forth. So they don't get it presented as a grid where they can quickly go through just to get it done without giving you accurate information, but they get presented one at a time, so that the quickest way is just to kind of give your actual opinion and work your way through the survey questions. So that's something to think about. So if you're thinking about a grid, I would recommend not doing it, and instead going with like kind of they see one question at a time on the screen, or on however they're answering the survey. Other things to be able to catch straight lining, another common technique is to reverse the direction of the scale to see if people are straight lining, or to estimate if people are straight lining, basically. So for example, if you've got a bunch of attitudes on different issues, and the direction of the scale for one is kind of more socially progressive to more socially conservative, you do that direction of the scale, but then you flip it so that for another one, it's kind of more socially conservative attitude towards a more socially progressive attitude. And the idea here is that, most people would answer similarly across on these scales if they're all in the same direction. And so you catch them and so if you reverse the direction of the scale, hopefully they pick it up, they're paying attention, and so they also reverse the kind of direction of their answer to match the new direction of the scale. But you catch straight liners by people who are going quickly through and answer all the same way, even if the scales are reversed, right? So say here, you would reverse the scale. Instead of going from not all important to very important, for a few of these, you would swap it to go from very important to not at all important, right? There are issues with trying to kind of catch straight liners that way. Some people might actually have that attitude, that kind of, even if you flip the scale, it ended up being similar numeric answer to the other scales. And so, yeah, there's that. It is also possible that like it's a real thing, and that people have different attitudes on the scales that you switched. But it's one way that some researchers will catch straight liners, if you're curious. So, other general things to keep in mind when you're kind of formatting your survey questionnaire. Regardless of kind of how you do the specifics of that formatting for your questionnaire, respondents should always be able to see the survey question and its answer options on the same page, right? So again, smartphone or paper format or whatever you're using in terms of presenting your survey question to respondents, they should see the survey question and all the answer options on the same page, right? They should not have to go to the next page to see answer options. That's bad, because then they'll miss those answer options. And so it's always survey question and answer options directly below it on the same page, as much as possible without having to scroll up or down. But, if you need to scroll up or down, that's still possible. Again, on the smartphone, this is my sign of a smartphone. But ideally kind of just all together so people can clearly see the question and all the answer options. I know it sounds silly, and of course, Sarah, I would do that. But it's sometimes when we've got a lot of other stuff to think about, we forget these things. But this is kind of like basics of a survey question and answer formatting is keep them on the same page for each question. Most of the time, you're always providing the survey questions in the same order to every respondent. That's your typical good methodology in survey research, right? Everyone gets the same questions in the same order. That being said, you can play around with that ordering a bit. Sometimes for certain surveys, you might want to randomize the order of the survey questions. So certain respondents at random get some ordering of questions, other respondents get another type of ordering with different questions coming first and later, that sort of thing. You can play around with that. There's might be some reasons why you might want to. If you're worried that the order of your survey questions might impact some of the answers, so if there's certain questions that you ask them first might actually impact the answers to later questions. If you're worried about that, you can randomize the ordering to hopefully mitigate some of that. One example I know from the field of sociology of religion, I think for a few years, the British census would ask the nationality question first and then the religious affiliation question after. I think that's how it worked. My colleagues from Britain can tell me if I'm wrong. But they asked, like, how British do you feel, or something like that, some kind of national identity question tied to being British. And then the follow-up question was like, do you consider yourself a Christian or not? Or like, what is your denomination or your religious affiliation? And because in people's minds, they kind of linked religion with nationality in that case, because the two questions were close together, they got a higher response of Christianity because they kind of thought like, oh, British are like Church of England or whatever, like the classic kind of historical religious affiliations of Great Britain. And so there was like a kind of boost to the rate of people who said they were Christian. Whereas if you just ask them on their own, what is your religion, if any, you would have had lower rates of Christian affiliation. So things like that. Sometimes the ordering of a question can impact certain answers. So that's something to think of overall, right? As you're placing questions, like, could this one really impact another one? Especially if you're asking things like attitudes about a certain topic and then the behavior type of the individual on that topic, like things like, what do you think about smoking? Do you smoke? You have to kind of think through what order you want to ask that in. And sometimes it's best to actually separate out, like first ask the attitude questions on different topics and then come back to some of the more behavioral questions so that people aren't like, oh, I said I don't like smoking, so I'm going to say I don't smoke, even though I actually do, that kind of thing. So it's kind of not right in next to people's minds, and they actually maybe forget what they said in the attitude and actually give their actual behavior later on in the survey. That's something to think about. And you can play around with that ordering, randomize it to see, to hopefully mitigate any impacts there. Or you can use it almost like an experimental design. You can randomly split respondents into two or a few groups, and the first group of respondents gets a certain ordering, the other group of response gets another ordering, and that's then you can test the impact of that ordering of survey questions on responses. So people who got this attitude behavior question first, does their behavior look different when they answered the later behavior question versus if they got the behavior question first and then answered an attitude question afterwards, right? So you can play around with it and then check to see if there was any impact later on. So that's a possibility. But usually most researchers don't feel the need to do that, and just kind of give the survey questions all in the same order so that if there is some kind of impact about the ordering of the survey questions on people's potential answers, then it's equal for everyone, right? So they all get the survey questions in the same order, and that's your typical best practice with survey questionnaires. So respondents should also always be provided with an information consent letter at the start of the survey. Here in Canada, that's an ethics requirement. So if you're working with a university institution within Canada, you have to get your survey data collection pre-approved by one of our ethics boards. It's the case here at the University of Waterloo. And one of their standard requirements is to always provide an information and consent letter at the start of the survey. Again, whether gets read to them if it's a telephone survey, or it's at the start of the paper questionnaire that was mailed to them, or if it's at the start of the online survey. All of that is good, and that's how it's often presented in different survey modes. But here we're talking about, giving respondents some kind of basic information about what the survey is about, who's running it, as well as asking them for their consent to take part in the survey and letting them know that if they don't want to finish the survey, if they want to stop completing the survey at any time, that they are absolutely allowed to can do so, that this is voluntary only, and that they can withdraw their consent at any time by stopping to answer the survey, and that if they do not complete the survey and they stop ahead of time, they just close their browser window, none of their data is saved. And so just letting them know that. And those are all kind of ethics requirements that we have to meet here in research. Again, I'm assuming this workshop video is more for researchers. If you're in the private sector or running like a personal survey with your friends, obviously this is less of a requirement for you. But it is still always good practice to give people a bit of information about the survey, again, to be kind of open and transparent and to gauge them with the survey. People seem to really like that, seem to like to know what you're researching, what your research goals are. Sometimes they'll just skip the letter, but some people are really into that and kind of appreciate being given some information about, what is the purpose of your data collection here, and then asking them for their consent to take part before you actually bring them to the first survey questions. And you always want to end your survey questionnaire with a thank you note. It can be very short, or it can be a bit longer letter, whatever you like to provide at the end of the survey, thanking respondents for their time, because for the most part, they are giving their time either freely or for very low incentives. And so that is always appreciated. Researchers always appreciate that from people, the time that they give. And so show that appreciation with a thank you letter at the end. I always include my email address at the end as well for research participants. So if they want to reach out to me, have any more follow-up questions about the survey, that my email address is in the start, the letter at the start, the information letter at the start, and also at the thank you letter at the end. So that, I'm available. And again, that's kind of added transparency. And people feel that if they want to reach out, most don't, but if they do want to reach out, they do. And I have had some great people reach out to me when I run the ISSP and other surveys. It's always wonderful to hear from them. So just kind of keep in mind that kind of to start and finish the questionnaire before you actually get into the questions themselves, just kind of like the introduction, asking people their consent to take part in this study. And once they've aware of that information and what the study is about, and then a thank you at the end. All right. So you've developed your survey questionnaires, their answer options, you've put them all together in what we call a survey questionnaire into this document or whatever, this programmed file. And now, before you actually run the survey, it is essential to pre-test your questionnaire. This is essential. If you're doing any kind of research that is, you want it to be good quality, you should pre-test your questionnaire, ideally in multiple ways, before you actually run it. Because once you launch your survey, that's it. You can't change anything, right? Everyone has to get the questions in the same order. The formatting always has to be the same person to person. So you can't change anything once you've actually put your survey out there, it goes live. So you got to make sure you get it right ahead of time so that, you don't just go and collect garbage data. And so different ways you can pretest your questionnaire. Once you've developed it, obviously you've put all your brain power. Maybe you're working with a research team who's put all their brain power into developing good quality questions and answer options and putting them all together in the proper order. And so, see my previous videos for guidelines to do that. But so you've got your questionnaire that you think is pretty good. It's, like any kind of text. It's never going to be perfect, but you're pretty happy with it. In that case, it's time maybe to go and send it to a few experts in the field that your survey is on, that is in the topic that you're working on, for example, to kind of get their feedback. And these are especially experts who maybe have run surveys before in this area. So, for example, I've got a few people I know who run surveys on religion and spirituality. And so when I develop a survey on those topics, which I often do, I will then send it to them and say like, hey, what you think? And they also do the same to me. So I give my feedback. So again, just getting a few extra sets of experts' eyes on your questionnaire to make sure that, there's no issues that maybe you didn't realize or didn't catch, but maybe the other experts can catch for you and you can fix ahead of time while you still can. Once you've done that, you've got some expert feedback, then it's time to actually, start doing some cognitive interviews. And that's probably cognitive interviews, one of the most common ways to pretest a survey questionnaire. This is where you gather, it does have to be a lot of people, but the more the better kind of thing. But, depending on what kind of access to people and resources you have, it can be anything like a kind of almost focus group setting where you've got like half a dozen to a dozen people in a room. You each give them your questionnaire. And then they kind of answer your questionnaire. And as they answer it, they give you feedback. So that can be question to question. So they answer the first survey question, then they give you your feedback. It's like, well, I didn't really understand what you meant by this, or you're kind of missing this answer option that would kind of cover me, or that I could think could cover other people. Or you get everyone to fill out the whole questionnaire, then get all their feedback at the end. It's kind of depending on how you want to do it. And there's different things you can look for while people are filling out your kind of draft questionnaire. So you can look for, obviously verbally what they tell you is probably the most important feedback. But other things like, oh, while they're filling out the survey question, is there hesitation? Are people taking a really long time to fill it out when I expected that they wouldn't? So that's what we call like behavioral coding. So like, is there issues that are kind of nonverbal? Like maybe are people frowning because they may not understand what the question is? Behavior coding is not always easy, because, maybe you're frowning because you don't understand a survey question, or you're frowning because you stayed up really late last night watching Netflix and you're just exhausted. So it's hard sometimes to pick up on what's due to the survey question, what's due to other factors. And you often, if you want to do proper behavioral coding, you often have to film the cognitive interviews to be able to pick up on all the nonverbal cues afterwards, which some people don't like. They might make them uncomfortable, people who are doing the cognitive interviews. And so, I'm not a huge fan of that kind of behavioral coding during the cognitive interview. I mainly rely on the verbal feedback that I'm provided by people as they fill out the survey. But that is something that some researchers might do. There's also things like vignettes. You can play around with different vignettes that you provide response, different scenarios that are tied to the survey question. Also, like you can experiment. So you can give different versions of a survey question to see which one people prefer, and then go with that one if you're still wondering about that, if you're not sure yourself. And then you can debrief at the end, right? So ideally, the way I typically do these cognitive interviews is after each survey question, I get people's feedback and kind of discussion of issues and how it could be improved if needed. And then at the very end, once everyone's done that for each survey question, a kind of general debrief about this questionnaire. Were there any kind of themes that people were expecting but that weren't covered, that maybe could be covered, that should be covered? Just general thoughts, general comments about the questionnaire overall. And then there's another type of pretesting, or set of ways of pretesting a questionnaire, and that's what we call more quantitative pretesting. And this is also something that I do for most of my surveys. So instead of launching the survey for everyone immediately, we'll often do what we call a soft launch, where, we finalize the questionnaire, we're pretty happy with it, we think it's good, this is the version we want to go with. But instead of immediately launching it to everyone, we do a soft launch with only maybe like a couple hundred of respondents rather than like 2,000. So we just do like a couple hundred people, not the full size sample, but these people being part of your target demographic. Same with the cognitive interviews, by the way. The cognitive interviews, if your study population is general population, then you have some people, different demographics from the general population. If your study population is just like senior citizens, well, your cognitive interviews is just with that target population of senior citizens. And the same with this soft launch, right? You kind of do it for, your target type of sample and the demographics within that sample. And you get them to fill out the survey. So they don't give you verbal feedback or anything, but while they're filling out the survey, you're looking for issues. So things like, do certain questions have higher non-response that you weren't expecting? And why might that be? Are there certain questions that take much longer to answer for respondents where you weren't expecting it? Is the speed of completion very different from what you were expecting? Are people going way quicker or much more slowly through the questionnaire than what you thought? And all of these could potentially be red or yellow flags about, issues that you might want to have a look at before you do a full launch of the survey questionnaire. So things like, okay, is it something about the survey question that means that more people aren't answering it, or that's taking them longer to answer than what it should be? Okay, so all things to think about when you're building your survey questionnaire and kind of starting to program it and kind of the initial stages of getting it finalized. So all of those steps, good ones to follow, good guidelines to keep in mind. And keep in mind, I mean, if you're expecting that you're always going to be super happy, it's perfect, you're going to feel your survey questionnaire is perfect at the end, you're all like, it's going to be 100% great. I mean, I don't usually get that feeling. Most researchers don't usually get that feeling. Kind of like whenever you write anything like a book or an article or anything, including writing a survey questionnaire, I mean, there's always ways it could be improved or changed. At some point, you just have to say, like, okay, I've done my best. I've put all these good guidelines into practice. I've consulted experts. I've pre-tested the questionnaire. And, I don't see any serious issues. Let's go. At some point, you just have to make that decision. And so I just kind of heads up. I don't know if there's going to be like this epiphany moment that you're going to feel like, oh, it's ready. I've never felt that. It's just like, okay, I think I've got it good to go as much as I can, and let's do it. But make sure you give yourself enough time before the survey to actually develop your questions adequately, their answer options adequately, and putting it all together in the questionnaire and pre-testing that questionnaire. All the steps we've seen in this workshop series, those are key steps to make sure you're collecting good quality, accurate data on the topics and the themes that are important for your study. And that you're not collecting garbage data that become useless afterwards. And so, all good practices to put into effect that we've covered in this workshop series. I want to just conclude this video, the last few minutes, to kind of remind you or go over the steps in running a survey, now that we've kind of talked about this development process over the last few videos. So we started the first video in this workshop series kind of covers the first step here is, and it's actually the most important step in my opinion, and the one that you should probably spend the most time on to make it clear, like, what is it you want to know from people? What do you want to measure? What's the goal of your study or multiple goals of your study? And, who do you actually want to know it from? Who's your study population? Who do you want to survey? What is your overall larger research questions? All of those are important details to kind of get right and get clarified in your mind before you actually take the next steps of writing up survey questions and their answer options and putting them together in a questionnaire, which is the second step. And so that was kind of more the second and third workshop videos in this workshop series. And then once you've got that full questionnaire, we talked about it, then you pre-test your questionnaire, step 3, so kind of covered in this video. And that's typically at what stage, at least in Canada, when you'd get ethics approval to run the survey. If you're a member of a Canadian university, you need that ethics approval to do so, to make sure you're not causing harm to your respondents. And the ethics board, as a side note, if you're interested, the ethics board wants a full and final version of your questionnaire. So you have to develop ahead of time before you do your ethics application and get approval from your university's ethics board. Once you've got that approval, right, you know what you want to know, you figured out what you want to know, you've developed your survey questionnaire, you've pre-tested it, you got ethics approval if you need it from your university, then it's time to actually run the survey, to go and collect your data. Now, steps 5 through 8 are not covered in this workshop series. They are covered at least in part, but mostly in other workshops run by Statistical Consulting and Survey Research Unit here at the University of Waterloo. But just so you know, the kind of final steps, you administer the survey, collect the data, and then you clean that data, you manage that data. Once you get it in the kind of data matrix, its raw form, you give it a clean, you kind of shape the variables as you need them for your research. You analyze that data using statistical modeling that is adequate for the variables and goals you're aiming for. And then you present your key findings in whatever format that best suits your needs. So that's kind of the whole process of doing survey research in especially the social sciences, but more generally as well. I mentioned earlier on at the start of the video, I'll mention it again, lots of services available from the Statistical Consulting and Survey Research Unit at the University of Waterloo. So check them out, look them up online. If you're, especially if you're beginning survey research, you haven't done a whole lot of surveys before, you want an extra set of expert eyes on your survey at each stage of that process of running a survey, developing the questionnaire, running the survey, analyzing the data. Well, we've got a great team of people that can provide those services for you. Some of those services are free. There's kind of free consultations for data analyses. Other services are cost recovery. So we're a nonprofit unit here at the university, but we do have costs related to running surveys, paying for samples, the person's time and salary to be able to run certain surveys. And so it is cost recovery, but it is available to you, especially if you've not done a whole lot of survey research. It's great to have this team on your side and to kind of make sure that all your steps are done well so that you're getting good quality data at the end of the process. But also, if you're someone like me who runs a lot of surveys and just doesn't have the time to do all of those steps yourself, so maybe, I developed the survey questionnaire with the ISSP, but I get the Statistical Consulting and Survey Research Unit often to program the survey for me in Qualtrics and to actually manage the running of the survey with the sample that we purchase. And then they also do a bit of the data cleaning for me before they send it back my way. I have grant money to help support them, and they often hire students, and so it's a great way to support training of students at the same time. But those students are trained by highly and mentored by experts in the unit. And so it's great quality work that everyone produces. And it means that takes it off my plate. And so I can work on other stuff while the survey is being run. So all things to think about. And if you are looking for somewhere to help you run your surveys, well, the University of Waterloo and that Statistical Consulting and Survey Research Unit is a great place to look up. I've also put some additional reading resources here if you want to read up more on various aspects of survey methodology. I mean, there's a lot of great textbooks and articles and other materials out there for survey research. Here on this slide and the next slide is just a couple, like a handful of ones, especially ones we have access to at the University of Waterloo that's at our library. But if you have a university library or some other kind of more research-focused library, I'm sure there's probably a number of good quality books on survey methodology, either digital or paper copies of those books on survey methodology. And they can be from different disciplines because that survey methodology doesn't change a whole lot. So regardless if you're like across the social sciences, if you're political science, psychology, economics, sociology like me, or even other areas, running surveys with people is a pretty, it's not rocket science, although there are definitely things to know for good practices. And so it doesn't vary that much discipline to discipline. So a survey methodology book from psychology would probably just be as useful for political scientists than one directly from political science. And so, yeah, have a look to see what's available to you. I've got some up here as well. Some of them are kind of newer, more recent. Some of them are just old classics from the 80s and 90s that are still very relevant for today. Obviously, less of a focus on online research in those older books, but things like how to develop good quality survey questions, like that hasn't changed a whole lot over the decades. Good quality practices are pretty similar on that front over the years, over at least the last few decades. Got some other ones here. So again, you can pause the video if there's some of these that you want to actually look up and go and have a read because they're all great resources. Okay, so that was it for me. So thanks so much if you watched this video and if you did the whole the whole 4 videos of this workshop series. It was great chatting with you. I love survey research, so I love talking about it. I hope this survey series was helpful for you, specifically focused on questionnaires. Yeah, and I wish you all a very happy, successful survey if you are running one, and happy research for your projects. And yeah, feel free to reach out to me anytime. I love to hear about research, so I love to hear from you. And yeah, I wish you all the best for your surveys and for your whole lives in general. All right. With that said, it's good seeing you. Good talking with you on this workshop series, and maybe see you in a future series about survey research. Bye.